Hello, my name is Cassia. I work with partnerships and outreach at Climate Kick, and I'm founder of Youth Climate Leaders, an organization that helps young people to find jobs in the climate economy. And today I'm here with Valerie, the Global Director for Environment, Natural Resources and Blue Economy of the World Bank. Thank you so much for having this time with us.
No, thank you, Cassia, for coming and talking to me.
I think people are curious to see your view. How have you found COP28 so far? What do you hope that it will achieve?
So, it's amazing. We talk an awful lot about energy in the COP, as we should, because if we're going to bend the curve of emissions to zero, we have to change how we have energy. But one of the things I've noticed that's so valuable here is personal energy. We're all running around.
Yeah.
And what I love, and what I was saying to someone earlier, it's like a family reunion. We see friends, we see people who've been working in this business for a long time, and we see new people, particularly young people coming who are starting out, giving us that new energy.
Yeah.
But I think the thing that has really made me happy at this COP, for years we've been talking about nature, and we know nature is an engine of combating climate change.
Yeah.
It's a third of the solutions to mitigation, particularly important, of course, to the oceans and the forest, the ocean and the forests. But it's also really important for adaptation, because for most poor countries, the only climate technology they're going to have access to are nature-based solutions. And this is the first COP. It started in Glasgow, got a little bit louder in Egypt last year, but this is the first COP where we've all taken yes for an answer. We agree nature is part of the solution, and it's part of the agenda in a serious way. Not just today on Nature and Ocean Day, but it was part of the Finance Day, Climate Finance Day on last Monday. And so it's an exciting time to be part of the nature discussion, because finally we're at the big boys and girls table. We're not at our own table talking to ourselves, we're talking to everybody.
No, that's great. I think you anticipated my second question a little bit, because where do you go from here, like when it comes to the finance necessary to the climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, and also now loss and damage? And how can an institution like the World Bank mobilize this in the nature context?
I think what we've realized when it comes to finance is we have to work across the supply chain of finance. There's so many actors, so many places where money comes from, and I think sadly the whole has been a lot less than the sum of the parts for a long time, because there's lots of money being given by lots of different domestic governments are using their domestic budgets to really try and move the climate agenda. International public finance like the World Bank is spending lots of our finance, almost 40% of our annual budget, and we're investing $70 billion a year just on the public sector side. Lots of philanthropies, and even the private sector is getting in, but we're each doing our own thing. So one thing that the COP discussions here have really emphasized is how much we have to work across the supply chain. We have to look to see, where does upstream philanthropic capital come in? That is often money that is very patient, very willing to take risks. How do we work with the public sector, particularly at home, to do things like reform subsidies? Because just on the biodiversity side, there's a $700 billion a year financing gap. We're never going to get $700 billion of investment every year. We're just about making the $100 billion for climate finance this year. That means we have to reduce the price tag. We have to reduce cost. To do that, we have to reform subsidies. We have to repurpose them, because subsidies, just in agriculture alone, we're talking about $635 billion a year. A lot of those subsidies, only a third of which, by the way, go to farmers, they end up driving unsustainable behavior. They end up making the climate emergency worse. They end up making the loss of biodiversity worse. What we want to see happen is, how can we help governments think through, how do you repurpose subsidies? So you spend the same amount of money, you give it to the same people, but instead of, for example, in agriculture, giving it for extensification to cut down more trees to build bigger farms, you give it to them to intensify. And you make sure that they can have more production, more productivity out of the same plot of land, so that you can encourage both adaptation as well as mitigation and help with the nature crisis. So working together along the chain and doing all of this then to attract in private sector. At the end of the day, we need the private sector. And the private sector is already spending big amounts of money in the climate emergency and in biodiversity. On the climate side, renewable energy is commercial in many countries. The private sector is in there investing in, because it makes them money. On the biodiversity side, we have huge investments already in forestry, in fisheries, both of which are biodiversity-based sectors, and nature-based tourism. So for us, it's about thinking through, how do we bring more finance to the table that is helping bend that curve of emissions, that is putting money on the table, not just from multinationals, but particularly for small-scale fishers, small-scale farmers, how do they get access to their local banks? How can they go to their local bank and get a line of credit? So if they want to change some of the gear, if they want to invest in more resilient seeds, how can they get access to finance? And so it really is about the private sector, not just in terms of the capital markets, not just in terms of multinational companies, but down at the very forefront of where climate change is having much of an impact, through the retail banks. How do we support indigenous peoples, local communities, micro and small businesses, so they can be part of the fight?
Oh, amazing, like put the money in the right place and
Exactly.
change the incentives.
Exactly.
And I think there's a lot of win-win solutions, but perhaps I would like to hear from you about the win-lose solutions. What do we do when we make these changes and some people are going to be affected in the context of just transition?
And this is why just transition has to happen, not at the point of somebody taking on the loss.
Yeah.
I think too often when we talk about just transition, it's at a narrow moment in time when the coal mine is closed. Well, that's way too late to tell that coal miner, you're out of a job, sorry. It's more important that we have renewable energy, so you should go and try and find a job in the green energy transition sector. That's too hard. We need to start a generation earlier. We need to identify those communities, those sectors who we know in the next 10 or 20 years, they're going to end up losing their job. How do we already start reskilling them? How do we help them with things like mortgage finance? Because you have communities who buy homes around coal mines because that's where they're invested. When the coal mine closes, that house is not going to be worth anything. Nobody is going to move to that community. And now that nest egg, that investment that a family made, the wealth that they built, can disappear overnight. So how do we already start thinking through things like mortgage finance earlier in areas where we know jobs will be leaving? How do we figure out reskilling in a serious way? How do we think about social safety nets? What does it look like to make sure that people who have done some of the hardest jobs, for all of us, who are the ones who sit on planes that are fueled by fossil fuels, who have homes that are fueled by fossil fuels, the people who are in the mines digging up that coal, who are working on the oil rigs, who are bringing that oil to us, have some of the hardest jobs out there. They deserve to have earned an ability to retire with dignity, with plenty of money in their pocket, with plenty of food on the table. We need to make sure we can expand social safety nets so they have access to that.
Totally. We are going to talk about reskilling youth soon, but perhaps to close on the main topics of COP, we talk a lot about energy, which is the big thing, but also there was a recent declaration of food systems. So how funding nature-based solutions can help with these commitments of this declaration? And do you have any example of a World Bank project that you could...
So we're very excited. So we have something called Country Climate and Development Reports. And these are diagnostics we do in a country that says, here's your development ambition, here's the reality of climate change, and taking the two together, what do you need to do? Take the Republic of Congo, for example, and we just did a CCDR there. Agriculture and land use change is a huge source of their emissions. We know that. They still have a tiny part of the emissions. They're not the problem, but they have emissions. They also, more importantly, have a huge impact on their agricultural sector from climate change. From climate change, you know, it's a story of water. They have too much at some periods of the year, they don't have enough at other periods of the year. So basically, we're talking to them, we did this diagnostic and we realized that nature-based solutions and investment in nature-based solutions in the Republic of Congo in the agricultural sector isn't a defensive agenda. It's not simply to keep them at current productivity so that at least they're not worse off. Because we can't treat adaptation as simply a way of stopping poverty from getting worse. We have to think about it as an agenda of opportunity. And in the Republic of Congo, when we've identified nature-based solutions for terracing, for water management, for better soil management, for integrated pest management, that is cheaper than traditional methods and will lead to an increase of 50% in maize production. 10% in maize production, 50% in cassava production. This is huge. This means that climate change adaptation is not something we're talking about anymore as something you have to do to just stay where you are. Now we're talking about nature-based solutions and climate adaptation as a way to accelerate progress, as a way to get out of poverty faster. And that, to me, is super exciting.
And before our conversation, just mentioned that at Climate Kick we had a winner from our main entrepreneurship award that is using Angico trees to produce leather. And there's a lot of nice entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, and we are going to close about youth very soon, but how can we help these kind of initiatives to gain scale? Any ideas?
I think one of the things we have to do broadly in an abstract way is stop financing nice projects that we don't think about how those projects go to scale.
Yeah.
With all new technology, new innovations, new ideas, there's this valley of death.
Yeah.
There's a lot of money to help somebody think through an idea, to make prototypes, to do it in a nice little project, but it's not connected to the market. If an idea isn't connected to the market, if it can't go commercial, if it can't go to scale, it's going to wither and die. And we've spent, I mean, Cassie, when we started talking about all of the money. There's been so much money wasted on good ideas, but because those good ideas aren't shared, because they're not plugged into the capital markets, because they're not plugged into markets, they wither and die. And you've got brilliant minds who become so annoyed, and this is particularly true, I think, of why so many young people get frustrated. Got great ideas, they invent great solutions and technologies, they even get a little bit of funding to test them, and then the funding dries up.
Yeah.
So we have to find a way to bridge that valley of death, to make sure that good ideas, when we find them, we know about them, they should be talked about here at COP, and then basically they should be auctioned off, and we should be coming in and figuring out how do we invest in these, how do we take them to scale, how do we make sure they don't wither and die.
No, totally. You have to connect like policymakers with the innovators,
Exactly.
with experts like
Exactly.
you, so that we have ideas that are solving the main problems we are seeing here.
Exactly.
And combine ideas that are similar with larger, perhaps, companies that can help them to scale. I'm really curious to see this happening more in the future.
Is this something, Cassia, that you talk about with other youth leaders that you know, this idea that we just need to go to scale better?
Yeah, not only youth leaders, entrepreneurs as a whole, because we see similar things happening in India and then a similar project in other countries. So how can we help this to gain scale? And there's like a financing problem. I think there's a lot of funding for beginning, as you said,
exactly.
let's help them test,
Yes.
and a lot of funding VC, like very large ideas, but nobody helps you go from A to B.
Exactly.
And that's like something
this bridge financing is more and more important. And I think as we shift in the nature space where I work, we're shifting from a sort of a philanthropic charitable model where it's all about conservation and working with people in order to benefit nature towards a model where we're working with nature to benefit people sustainably. How do we figure out how to transform natural capital into an engine of jobs and GDP? How can we attract entrepreneurs into this space? But to do that, we need to be committed across the supply chain. We can't come in, give them a nice project, say nice things, and then all disappear. It's figuring out how do we take that idea, make sure people know about it, and provide the kind of venture capital that happens in the software business, that happens in other spaces, that can get people past that valley of death towards commercial scale, which is the only way we're going to be able to bend the curve of emissions to zero.
And I saw an increase of venture studios that want to do precisely this, because then you have support from the whole process. You are not just by yourself. So
and this is what we need, the best minds, the best entrepreneurs working on the climate challenge. Not necessarily working just on AI or not working on how to spread social media faster. We need them working on the existential threat of today, which is climate change and nature loss.
Well, I think that's the perfect time for me to go to our final part of the interview, talking about the role of young people, because I see, and that's why I found that Youth Climate Leaders, a lot of young people were asking me, how can I work with this? Because if you don't channel this anger, this frustration into action, you get depressed, as we are seeing. So what is the whole role for the young people, and what are the new jobs that they might look at? Because not everyone will be an entrepreneur, and I feel there is also a lack of supporting for young people that want to work on the job before even being entrepreneurs or not.
No, and this is, we need young people coming into the climate space across the value chain. People working in policy, people coming in and being entrepreneurs, people working in finance who understand climate and can bring that lens with them. We need them across the chain. But I think my ask of young people is that we transform all of that energy that's in the advocacy space. Take yes for an answer. We are working on this. We are trying. It's hard. Instead of always telling us to do more, come and do more with us. Come and work for the World Bank, work on our projects, come and work in the private sector, come and work with companies like Nestle, who have a commitment to zero deforestation and want to figure out how to help their producers from where they're producing in field to fork, where you can have a supply chain. Work in the news media, tell a better story, because we're not telling this story well. And you know, a lot of us in the older generation are not going to be here forever, and we grew up in a generation where communications was different, where the world was different. We need a lot of young people come in who grew up with a phone in your hand. You grew up understanding how to reach hundreds, thousands, millions of people at a time, who understand the power of advocacy, but instead of just telling us to do more, come and do more with us.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think like if you want to change a system, you have to build a new one that makes the old obsolete. So that's and I give classes at the Burgundy School of Business on sustainable development policies. And one of the things that I talk to my students is that now is the time to focus on the how.
Yes.
Like for like this kind of conference. And we had a lot of on what and why, but now it's the how. And that's why like also I created Youth Climate Leaders, because I see so much on advocacy, as you said. But
Amen,
we have
Cassia.
to focus these bright minds on how to get there. And sometimes we are in like on an event and an entrepreneur is presenting something, and the advocacy side someone say, oh, but this packaging is not perfect. What I used to say this, I want to invite this person. I'll say, yeah, you're right. Can you help me to solve this?
The perfect cannot be the enemy of the good, and the good enough.
And if it's not good enough for you, do you have a solution? Because I think you cannot point to a problem if you don't want to make a solution.
Our new president, Ajay Banga, has a great saying. He says, done is better than perfect.
Yeah.
And because there are people today who are going to go to bed hungry, because in the Horn of Africa, 5 years of drought because of climate change means they're just not able to grow food, I don't want a philosophical discussion about why we should do something. Come and help me think through what we do, how we do it fast, how we do it better, but that's what we need to do, because done is better than perfect.
I think that's the message that can close this conversation on a good note. And if you have any comments, any project you want to promote, put here on the comments for us to see. Thank you so much. It was very inspiring.
Cassia. Muito obrigada.
De nada, muito obrigada.